All right, so we're going to take a look at 3D Studio Max in this one. And a lot of you guys watching the channel are trying to learn Blender Master Modeling and working with Substance Painter and whatnot. But when you go to apply to jobs, you're going to find that some studios, their pipelines, they either require Max or Maya. So you're going to have to learn these things at some point sooner or later. Now, for myself, I learned 3D modeling in 3D Studio Max and then moved to Blender. But you guys might be moving Blender to 3D Studio Max. I just want to kind of meander around the software and just play with some different things. And you'll see that they're actually not too dissimilar. Once you get over the user interface changes, you'll find a lot of the same features. Sometimes things work a slight bit different, so there are some little nuances to it, but for the most part, very, very similar. So this is like your outliner on the left. There's nothing special here. Your modifier panel and all that other fun stuff you have is over on the right, more or less. And so we actually start on the create panel, and you can create whatever you want: cylinders, cubes, things like that, lights, cameras, particle systems, physics systems, all kinds of fun stuff in here, and including bones. So let's just create like a cube real quick just to get started here with this video. And when you create cubes here, there's basically non-destructive at first. So like you can change things like height and width segments. You'll see we already created a cube, so it doesn't update that necessarily, or does it? We can't see the edges right now. So you hit F4 and you'll see we can't actually change those here on this still. This is just one place you possibly could do that, but you can do it under the modifier panel as well. And you'll see it's a box. And we have all the options here available to us as well. Okay. And so that's where we're going to get into the stack workflow more or less. And it's similar to Blender's workflow, except you have the ability to kind of work either non-destructively or semi-destructively with some of the modifiers, depending on which ones you use. It'll throw a little pop-up if you ever do anything where you're trying to like work back down the stack and it destroys something above it. It'll tell you it's going to cause problems before you do it. So but we don't have a bevel modifier. We have a chamfer modifier. That's the big thing here. So when you start, figuring out these little nuances, it actually becomes really easy to understand. We have a lot of the same stuff here going on. It might be laid out a little bit different, but like the mittering type right now is set to uniform. Normally in Blender, you're setting the mitter to arc. Well, in our case, it's just radial in this situation. So if we were doing like a Boolean in-gon model, that's what we would end up having to do. And then a lot of other things are in here as well, like the weighted normals modifier. It's going to look a little bit different perhaps compared to Blender, but that's something in there. If we had some other objects going, like another cube, we can use, first of all, middle mouse just pans, Alt middle mouse orbits, and then Control Alt middle mouse zooms in and out. Z will focus on whatever you have selected, so that's nice. Sometimes it's useful to play around with different types of orbits. Right now we're doing zoom extents selected, and we're going to do orbit sub objects. Okay, so it's going to just basically right click to get out of that, Alt middle click. If we ever end up in edit mode, it'll orbit around our vertices or whatever we have selected. So, but we just want to play with this cube real quick. So Q is selection right here, select object, and it also toggles this. So if you hit Q again, you see, the spray paint can is like the circle selector in Blender, basically, something like that anyways. Now W will move, E rotates, R scales. It's very simple and straightforward stuff, right? So we just want to move. We're going to grab it, use the gizmo. Max is very heavily left click, mouse dependent, I guess. It's so much so it actually kind of flares up my carpal tunnel when I use this program too much. So it's one of those things. It's actually pretty intense. So let's go ahead and do a Boolean. And when we do the Boolean, this is kind of new here. I haven't got to play around with this a whole lot, but it's similar to what you would find with like hard ops inside of Blender. Now, out of the box, Max and Blender out of the box, I would say Max edges out Blender just a little bit, but when you start adding add-ons to Blender, it starts to become really good. Same could be said and true for Max as well. There are plugins you can get for Max that make it more efficient and more effective. But for now, this Boolean system was added, which used to have to be a plugin, and now it's not a big deal. Whoops, wrong one. You can change these later if you do the wrong one. So I'll set it to a subtract, but basically we could do a Boolean. That's all I was trying to show there. And so we can keep kind of working with this if we want to add another chamfer, and we're going down that stack workflow now. And we could change like settings for this. So like the minimum angle, for example, like we can bump that up and tweak it a little bit perhaps. And you can see our corner, right? So that chamfer needs to be set to radial. Something kind of cool is you can save presets here as well. So you can just click here and then hit the ones you like anyways, which is nice. And you'll also see that our shading maybe not looking too well right now. We can add a weighted normal to it. Boom. There you go. And so there's a lot more to Max, of course. There's like smoothing groups and all kinds of other fun stuff you can do, but weighted normals definitely do work well. The grid, if you just don't want to see it, just hit G. A lot easier to turn off. But there we go. So we have an object created now like so. One of the main reasons I bought Box Cutter was because I used to use this tool a lot. And so under this tab, Splines line here, this is actually kind of a Bezier curve here. It can be a little bit of everything, I guess. But you click and click and click and click, and you can go ahead and create an enclosed polygonal shape like that, no problem. And later on, you can do something like an extrude modifier, right? Boom. And now you can just extrude that up. Very simple, very fast, which is cool. But the line tool, you can also click, click, and then like click and drag, you see? And so you can click and drag and do all kinds of cool little shapes like this very fast anyways. Close the spline. And so we'll go to the modifier panel. You can see it's just a line, but we have options. We can adjust the points, and we can do that number. We can convert those. So we can right click them, say like a Bezier, and we can go ahead and lay that out like so and do whatever we want with it basically. And work with it anyways. We can do an extrude like we just did, but we can also just go ahead and do something like an edit poly modifier. We can go ahead and create that. And when we get into this here, you can expand that if you want, but also this is taking effect up here as well. So you press 1, you get vertex selection, 2 edge, 3 border, 4 face or polygon, and then 5 is element. So element's going to be like sub objects. When you have a single object and it has multiple meshes in it, you can select the different elements as needed if they're disconnected from each other, basically. So in Blender, you would have to use the L key. Over here, it's just an additional number tap. So it's kind of nice that way. And you'll find that there's pros and cons to working here as opposed to working in Blender, perhaps. Both of them have pros and cons, but very comparable in a lot of ways. So this one, like we want this, and this vertex, we have to cap these a lot of times to create a face, and then that's what that is. You see the resolution over here? It's pretty high, right? Maybe we don't want that many vertices. If we go back to line right now, there's the warning dialog. It's going to say we're going to break our edit poly, basically. We can try to go back and then try to go back, but we might end up with errors. The reason this occurs, though, is because of the spline itself. All the way down at the bottom, there's the interpolation steps. We can reduce the quality of that as low as we need it, basically. So if we do that, there we go. Let's say steps 2, we go back to edit poly, and you'll see, yeah, it kind of broke everything. Unfortunately, we would have to redo it. So that's just something that could happen to you. You can see it's a complete mess now. All right, so just keep that in mind. You might have to delete these sometimes and just re-add them back, and then get back at it with new edits, so that way it's not all a giant mess anyways. So that's what that is. It's pretty simple and easy to understand. Now, let's go through some more stuff real quick. So we're going to go ahead and select this, get out of the edit mode. You just tap one of these. So you turn off like vertex selection. It's kind of goofy the way it's working, but we can delete that. Just hitting delete now. Let's go ahead and create a rectangle. Oops, sorry. We're in splines. Let's do a cube. Standard primitives, box. You'll see it's actually set to box, not cube. So right, and we create that real quick, and we can add some segments. I just want to talk about some selection methods here. Nothing real fancy, I think, but might be worthwhile for some of you. So we go through that whole process. Now, if we go to here, you can see we can still modify it. You can do another edit poly perhaps, but you can also right click. And if you want to go destructive, you can just convert to an edit poly and just collapse all that down anyways. Right. So face selection, we have a lot of the same kind of tools that we have inside of Blender here inside of Max. A lot of these have been here for a very long time too. Like almost virtually everything up here has been here since like 2006. So it's very unchanging sometimes. But we'll find that in this little menu here, there's a lot of stuff in here that you could potentially utilize. A lot of guys just like to expand this thing out like this. I don't personally care for that much, but one of the things that you can find in here is a soft selection menu. and you'll see it just went to right there. Okay, and soft selection is proportional editing basically in Blender. So you can actually set up your fall off curve here. You can click use soft selection, but that little button here is also use soft selection. So most of the stuff in here is up here somewhere, but not all of it. So you want to spend some time over there learning all those different things. But you can see that's basically soft selection. And you can drop this down. There's some additional options in here if it has a drop down for all these different tools. So that's good to know. Soft selection itself, you can see we can change the fall off perhaps. And so we can do something like that. And it visualizes it for you, which is nice. All right. And yeah, there's definitely more to jump into with this kind of stuff, but we'll leave soft selection alone for now. We have one selection. You can grow, shrink it like you would in Blender with control number pad plus, minus. Loop selection is actually kind of interesting. If you select one face and you click loop, it goes in both directions. But if you kind of give it a direction to go and you click loop, it selects the loop you expect, which is actually kind of fun because now you can actually say like, you want to do those as loops, right? And it selects all of those for you basically. Okay. There's also like the loop mode selection, which is interesting. Play around with that one. We're not going to go over it, but let's see if we can't do like a proportional edit here real quick, or soft selection. Let's just do a curve. And let's take a look at this. So there's kind of, Blender doesn't really have this feature in vanilla. You have to get the machine tools add-on to get similar behavior. But like if you wanted to rotate an edge on a curve like this, you can't really GG twice it in Blender. There's nothing really you can do in vanilla Blender. Here in Max and in Maya 2, this is something you'd have to get used to using. You have what's called edge constraint, right? So we can now switch over to rotation. We can actually just rotate this right here, no problem. And it slides along the edges more or less. So it's not quite, edge constraint's kind of like GG twice, but it's a little bit better in some ways. And so you can see it will lock to the edges, doing as such like so. Now, if you're looking for this behavior in Blender, the closest you're going to get to it is going to be the Machine Tools Deus Ex version, where you can do edge rotation, but you can't actually move them around quite the way we would if we were working here in Max. So next one up is face constraint. I went over this quite a bit in some of my videos. Once again, a Machine Tools add-on. It's going to be surface slide is what they're going to call it. But basically this tries to lock down the volume basically. So you can see we can actually shift this around quite a bit. It tries to stay on the surface. Like you can't pull things off of the surface. So edge constraint is pretty useful. It's also another one where you can try to only move on normals, which you'll find can be quite useful. Sometimes it's like inflating your mesh basically. So that's a good one to have as well. And then we get into some more interesting territory, perhaps. We can do things like relax. This is a proper relax, unlike a lot of the add-ons for Blender, which just kind of don't do the right thing. Or Blender's alternative really is going into sculpt mode using the slide relax tool and holding shift. That's the relax tool in Blender. That works best anyways. And we can also, you know, like create new faces in our case, right? So we can just click create, boom, there we got a new face now. Okay, kind of fun. Let's see over to there. Let's select by edge and you'll see, I think it's upside down. Yeah. So backface culling used to be on by default, I think, in Max, if I remember correctly. It's not as of right now, I guess. The trick with this one is in object properties. You can right click object properties. This is all the stuff you would get in like your object properties in Blender for the most part. You can turn on backface culling if you wanted to. And when you find something like this, you can see it's not quite right. You can just flip it. Okay, that's the main thing there. You can just flip it. Not a big deal. If you select an edge, you can hold shift and drag it out. It basically extrudes it. Matter of fact, any of these faces, if you were to select them, you hold control, you hold shift, it extrudes it basically, right? You want to extrude along normals, something like that. We can just grab that, select loop perhaps. You see the extrude here. There's a little drop down that says extrude settings. Don't bother clicking on the little arrows all the time. Just hold shift and click. All right. And you'll see that this option here will let us switch to local normal. All right. And so we'll be able to do something like that. This is whether it's going to be non-unit or even or not even basically on that one. So we can extrude in that manner as well. Super easy way of doing that, I guess. So you see a lot of similarities here starting to pop up. A lot of those things you could do in Blender, you can do over here for the most part. Same thing's going to happen. Like if I select this edge and double tap, we can select the loop. If we want to do a chamfer or a bevel, right? We can do that just by doing that. Click check mark. That'll go away. Sometimes you end up with doubles, and just like Blender, this is merge by distance basically, or weld, and you can change the amount if you shift click on it. So you can see what's going on there. One thing that Blender doesn't really do, it can do, but it's a little tricky to set up, is target welding. You have to turn on vertex snap, and then you have to turn on auto merge by distance, and you can start doing target welding basically with snapping. Over here, it's just a button. You select by vertex. You can pull these like one to the other. So turn on target, click, drag, and it's just that fast. It's really that easy. Nothing revolutionary there really, or breaking, crazy, groundbreaking, I guess. So you'll see the menu changes also depending on what you're using, right? So some of these all change anyways. We do have like bridging. We can do what's called geopoly, but yeah, a lot of just typical standard stuff. Like we have insets as well. So if I select some of this real quick, we do like an inset. You can just click that and then click and drag, done. Or you can shift click it. It's not really a whole lot of options here except for group or by polygon. I mean, that's really it. So that's what you get with that one anyways. We won't do that. This is a sub object now. So you can see we can actually use that element selection. Delete maybe. Not too big of a deal. All right. And so, yeah, we pretty much went through a lot of this. Let's talk about shortest path selection. It's going to be kind of interesting here. It's very similar to Blender's, except you hold shift first and then click, and now you can start making a shortest path selection. Click here, and click here. You got a selection now, just like that. All right. And so we get that selection going and selected by face. Let's see what else we can do in here. Okay, I guess my option disappeared. Sometimes that happens, like some of these will like minimize or something weird sometimes. But I'm looking for something that maybe we skipped over. P-Connect's interesting, but it's not what I'm looking for. It's just like you can just kind of drag and cut, basically. It's interesting, but I was looking for, yeah, insert edge loop is interesting, but that's, I don't know where my option went, to be honest. It's gone. It's disappeared. I was just playing with it earlier. It's the connect feature anyways, and maybe I'm just not seeing it. That can happen sometimes. So whatever the case, you see connect is over here. Okay. So no, you can connect with edges. I thought you did it with faces too, but maybe you don't. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. When you want to dissolve something, it's control backspace. You don't use delete. So like if you wanted this whole thing gone and you backspace, it's going to leave vertices behind. So you want to go ahead and control backspace, right? You have to set flow add-on as well. So if you want to make sure your curves are nice and neat, you can just set, well, add-on. It's an add-on in Blender. It's native feature here is set flow in Max. So you can also remove whole edge loops just by clicking this one over here with loops, remove. You can do things like that, right? All right. So pretty much the name, that's it. Like that's all we're going to get into with the modeling, I think. There's certainly other little useful things sometimes, like you can do like subdivisions like that with mesh smooth or tessellate things. Certainly is. It's kind of interesting anyways. Let's delete this one for now. Let's go back to this one over here. You see I hit F. I'm used to hitting F in Blender to focus on things, but, or an Unreal Engine. It's Z here inside of 3D Studio. So P will take us back to perspective. Hit Z. If you ever want like a different layout, you can always create like these little tabs over here. So you can customize all of these so they're not just using wireframes perhaps. Like you can turn grids on and off and whatever else, and then switch back to your other view perhaps. And what I want to point out here though is with this one, let's go ahead and do a edit poly actually. Select by edge maybe. And so something that's interesting in Max that you don't have in Blender is that you can change the triangulation around. You can see there's a little option here called edit triangles. You can also turn them. Let's just do edit triangles for now. And you can see, we can actually see these little dotted lines now. So this is the actual triangulation without applying like a triangulate modifier per se. But what edit triangulation allows you to do is like you click on a corner in a vertex and you can click in another corner and you can reroute all the triangulation. So you can do this on Ngons. You can't do this inside of Blender unless you actually triangulate your mesh with a modifier and apply it. So it's one of those weird things that like, it doesn't seem like it's a big deal until you're dealing with really low poly game models and trying to optimize them. It's something that you'll end up wanting to utilize more than likely. And we get some really cool, just various little modifiers in here too. So like we might have the ability to quadrify things. So that's a possibility. It's a little bit hit or miss sometimes to quadrify the mesh. You can see it creates a little bit of a questionable topology sometimes, but you can bump the values around and try to get a better result out of it if you need to, which is fun. And now if we were to go back, you can also optimize with like a modifier, which is just fantastic, which Blender doesn't have. And this one, you can see it just, I might need to update it. Okay, maybe that's the wrong one. Pro Optimize is the one I'm looking for. There's like different modifiers that do different things. Okay, yeah, so we can calculate it now. In our case, it's not really reduced anything. It was already pretty optimized kind of setup. But you can see it's going to go through and it's going to reduce points and faces and kind of try to figure it out the best it can on its own. So it's kind of a cool little modifier for you. And, but other ones work as you would expect them to, that Blender doesn't just work out of the box and the way you would think it would. Like, for example, when you're using a lattice modifier in Blender, it's really problematic because you got to create the lattice and then you got to set up the modifier and then link them and whatever. But here it's just, you want the FFD modifier 2x2s done. And now you have this set up. So if we right click, or we can drop down the menu, you can see we can actually get a hold of control points. And if we want to use the move tool, we should be able to go ahead and start using this. Now, for whatever reason, it is not working. And there's a possibility that's like sometimes modifiers like mess up each other, I guess. So we'll try it again and just see what happens. And there's nothing happening. All right. Yeah. So let's just take this. We'll delete that. We'll get rid of the weighted normal real quick. Shouldn't bother anything too bad. It might mess the shading up a bit. But eventually you might, even take a mesh like this and you select it and get out of edit mode real quick. Or get off of those vertices anyways. Make sure I got the right selection there. You might convert these to an editable poly, right? And maybe now our modifiers or FFD will work, and it does. So yeah, sometimes they can interfere with each other. It's not everything works perfectly, but it's definitely it's useful sometimes to play around with those. But yeah, you can see we don't have to set up a lattice cage or anything crazy like that. It mostly just works here, and that's all we want out of a lot of modifiers, anyways. That they just work. Let's say we were going to do a mirror, right? There is a mirror modifier, but the one you're probably wanting is symmetry. And you can see symmetry here. We can use different axes as needed. All right, but let's just say we're going to do this one. You can also flip it. And then this is where Blender and Max can do basically the same thing, but Max is already set up with it, which is, once again, drop down. There's a mirror here. This used to be just called the gizmo or whatever. And you can see we can grab there, right click, boom. And now we can just set the offset of the mirror, or the symmetrize anyways, not the mirror. If we want to flip it and go the other way, we can do that. If we want to rotate this thing, we can. And so to make this to get Blender's modifiers to act sort of like this, you want to get the modifier list add-on. There's a little button in that add-on. So your modifiers, you can just click that button and it'll set up an empty so that you can do very similar things like this anyways. And that's something you'll want to get for sure. So like once you start adding add-ons to Blender, it becomes very powerful. It's definitely going to be on par or even better than Max in a lot of ways, unless you were to go ahead and get plugins for Max as well, perhaps, right? Anyways, so like all of these things kind of come together, and it's a really cool program once you really dive into it. We're only like scratching the surface here, of course. I mean, we have like snapping, for example, there's like, it's S and angle snap is A. Some of it's really simplistic in that manner. You can right click on this and change what you're snapping to. I have it on vertex, but usually it's grid points by default. Angle snap as well. You can right click on that, get into there. A lot of stuff you can just right click on and get more settings, and it's kind of a neat UI after a little while. Like it's neat as in it's fairly organized. You're not all over the place looking for your tools necessarily. In the sense here, like there's Arnold on the left, like this is like all Arnold stuff for the most part. So that's going to be the equivalent of like cycles, more or less. It's actually really good if you want to play around with it sometime. Check it out. It's definitely a good renderer. And yeah, so I mean, we have like the selection here. It can be either a partial hit when you do like a box selection, for example, where you get just a corner of it, perhaps. Let me get out of that for a second. So just a corner of it, or you might have to fully encompass it, basically. So something like that. That's the main idea with that. This is parenting, more or less. Link and unlink is right here. You can see we can just kind of set up this with either those two options, but it's basically your outliner. H key will also bring up something very similar to that. So this is going to be your ribbon right there for that. Okay. Curve editor. If you ever want to play with curves, there you go. Right click, curve editor, dope sheet. Okay. Very easy to access, very quick. You actually just throw them on the other monitor if you have two, and I recommend using two. It's really quite simple and easy to use. Timeline controls, view controls down here. So you want to play with like the orbit, the way it orbits. You can definitely do that, right? We have a mirror option up here and a align option. That maybe I'll do another video sometime on Macs, but that's what they are. Anyways, you can play with those if you need to. Yeah, schematic views and material editor. So the Slate material editor, I don't know when they added this thing. It was like 05 or something, I think. I think it came before the ribbon with all the modeling tools, but it was like the original DirectX was like DirectX 8 or something shader. So it's been a while since I've really put this program through its paces, but I definitely learned on it, and it's been around for a while, and then it's still an interesting program. So you can set up materials all day long here. If we apply this material right now, we're not really going to see anything really extravagant here happening because we got to set up the environment and everything else probably, or change the view options at least. And I'm going to add that weighted normal back because it is bothering me being shaded bad. Anyways, so the up here under rendering, you'll see environment. This is like your environment panel inside of Blender, basically, right? Under the render environment world settings or whatever. It's the same idea over here. We can change environment maps. We could use something like an HDRI image or something like that, perhaps. We can add atmospheric effects of volume, fog, fire, whatever. Exposure controls, global lighting. We can go over here to effects, and we can add whatever, like depth of field and lens blur and all kinds of other fun stuff. So that's all going to be under rendering for the most part. The material editors in here as well. You can render to texture, right? Or bake to texture, render surface maps anyway. So bake to texture, this is your baker. Very different than the one in Blender, right? And this is where Blender really should put some time into the software for baking, because it would be nice to have something more like this anyways. Like you select your object and you say you want to do like a normal map bake, you can just add normal map, and there you go, right? And you can see it's projected from self, but you can pick from scene or pick from a list, do things like that. You can do metalness, whatever, really, ambient occlusion. So select your object, add it to it, boom. And you can set up, you know, is it going to be a PNG or whatever? You can also set up over here on how much quality it's going to be, like grayscale 8-bit, perhaps in our case. What is this one by default? Grayscale 8-bit as well. It's a normal, so maybe RGB 24, 48-bit, really up to you, I guess. And so on and so forth, right? You can change the padding amounts, image size that you're going to bake, UV channels that are going to be utilized, and UDIMs and stuff like that. So, all right. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple of a baker. It's actually rather interesting. But if you want to utilize that, you could definitely put it to work, I'm sure, in this software. So, and yeah, so that's pretty much it for the most part. Like there's other panels that we haven't really gone through, but you're going to see like this is for like affecting your pivot points. I mean, and IKs and some other oddities in there. Setting up motion controllers and things like that, right? Then just this is your display options again for the most part. So it's like the same as just right clicking and then selecting your object, right clicking and doing object properties. It's a lot of the same kind of stuff. Some of it's different, some of it's the same. You can see like backface culling is right here and all that. All right, anyways, so moving on from that, last one is your utilities. This little drop down here, or this little button anyways. This is when you install your plugins. They should show up in here or wherever else they might show up in the software. But you can definitely do things like come through here, do panorama exporter perhaps, or poly counts and all kinds of other fun stuff. And there's little oddities like that. Like when you're trying to set up something like active viewport settings, you know, you might need to go to like, maybe I'm in the wrong section again. I think I am. Hold on. Maybe we go to, you see like each one of these has like a different right click. Active viewport settings. No, that's not the right one. Just viewport configuration. Okay. Statistics. So show statistics in active view. Of course, in Blender, I use this, and this is where I got all that idea from anyways. The reason why I set it up the same there is because I liked it over here. So we can see poly counts and vertices and frames per second and other stuff like that. So you can see, there you go. It's now working, right? And moving on from that, you can set up like different kind of UI setups and customize all kinds of stuff to some degree. It's not quite as flexible as Blender, but it's definitely, it's still a little bit flexible at least. And yeah, and that's just scratching the surface of everything here inside of 3D Studio. You'll find when you start getting into rigging, animating, setting up drivers and stuff, it's really actually pretty simple. It's actually, I think it's easier to work with animation here than Blender. And I haven't really messed around with Maya too much, so I can't say if it's better than Maya, but I imagine Maya's probably better at it, but I think it's going to be more complex. I have a feeling that's the case. And so Max might be a little bit simpler on top of that. So, you know, you'll have to play with the software, get in here, learn it, and just check it out. You shouldn't take forever in a day to go from Blender to this, especially if you've learned modeling and texturing like Substance and then rigging and exporting out to game engines, animating and stuff like that. You should be able to jump over here and have a pretty good time relatively fast, because it's definitely like kind of a little bit more cut and lean than a lot of people realize. Like the UI is a little terrifying at first, but it's definitely very well organized. Maybe not as many tutorials for it perhaps these days, but it's still a very capable software. And if a studio you end up at uses this in their pipeline, it would be beneficial to know this software for sure. On the flip side of this, if you want to go to a different type of studio that doesn't use this, you might want to learn Maya. Maybe they use that. But if they allow Blender, you know, just use that. So, you know, being more flexible if you're looking for jobs is definitely going to be a bonus. You know, having a little bit of time in each one of these, perhaps just learning some of the basics and the layout and configuration of the software. You should be able to pick up the softwares real fast. Basically, that's all I'm trying to say here. And so don't be afraid of, you know, like just installing something, looking at it. I've seen a number of guys doing this where they have lots of questions about a software and they want to ask questions about it or get answers on it. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm telling you, just install the software if you get a chance, even if it's just a trial, play around in it for a little while, you know, take advantage of those 30 free days to just learn everything you can about it. And you'll be better off for it. And you'll start to recognize like, you know, it's kind of like a mind game in some respects, because like the way you work in Max might be just slightly different than Blender, or the way you work in Blender might be slightly different than Maya. And as you learn the different ways of working in the different softwares, you kind of become a stronger artist because of it, right? So like just doing pure Booleans in Substance 3D Modeler, for example, is going to kind of work your brain in just a slightly different way than Blender would. And working in Maya will be just slightly different than, you know, once again, Blender would, or so on and so forth, all the different softwares you can utilize out there. But you really just got to take a moment, learn the software and just play around with it for a little bit and get comfortable in it. That's pretty much all I'm trying to say. And that kind of combines together, like all the different experiences and all the different softwares kind of combine together, and just so you're able to think in all kinds of different manners, and just someone who learned maybe just one software. So it makes you a stronger artist. That's all I'm trying to say. Okay. So anyways, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll check you out the next one. All right. Take care.